For decades, the world has been captivated by the story of a teenage genius who outsmarted the FBI, flew millions of miles as a Pan Am pilot, practiced medicine without a license, and became a legal prodigy, all before he was 21 years old. We know the name Frank Abagnale Jr. because of his best-selling autobiography and the blockbuster movie where Leonardo DiCaprio made his life look like a glamorous, high-stakes game of cat and mouse. We were told that he was pursued across the globe by a relentless FBI agent named Carl Hanratty, a man who eventually became his mentor and friend. It is a story about the brilliance of a young man and the redemptive power of the American dream. But what if I told you that almost every single word of that story is a lie? What if the real Frank Abagnale wasn't a master of disguise, but a master of the long con, and his biggest victim wasn't a bank or an airline, but the public itself? Today, we are opening the actual files of Joe Shea, the real-life FBI agent who inspired the character of Carl Hanratty. For the first time, we are looking at the documents, the arrest records, and the internal memos that tell a much darker, much more pathetic story than the one we saw on the big screen. To understand the magnitude of this deception, we have to look at the man behind the legend and the investigator who spent years trying to separate fact from fiction. The story usually starts with Frank's appearance on the television show To Tell the Truth in 1977. That was the moment the legend was born. Frank stood there and told the national audience that he had cashed millions of dollars in forged checks and escaped from the custody of the FBI by climbing through the toilet of a moving airplane. The audience loved it. The producers loved it. But sitting in a field office, the men who actually handled Frank's case were scratching their heads. One of those men was Joe Shea. Now, Joe Shea wasn't the grumpy, obsessive hunter depicted by Tom Hanks. He was a dedicated professional who actually grew to care for Frank, but he also knew the truth. And the truth, as recorded in Shea's own notes and the official FBI archives, is that during the years Frank claimed to be a pilot for Pan Am, he was actually sitting in a prison cell. Let that sink in for a moment. The core of the legend, the idea that a teenager was flying international routes and living in luxury hotels, is chronologically impossible. Investigative journalist Alan Logan recently spent years digging through the archives of the Great Meadow Correctional Facility in New York. What he found was devastating to the Abagnale myth. Between 1965 and 1970, the very years Frank was supposedly performing his greatest feats, he was actually incarcerated for most of that time. He wasn't in the cockpit of a Boeing 707, he was in a bunk bed in a state penitentiary. When he wasn't in prison, he wasn't pulling off multi-million-dollar heists, he was a small-time petty thief. The Joe Shea files reveal that the FBI wasn't chasing a ghost across the world, they were tracking a kid who was stealing from his friends and family. One of the most famous stories Frank tells is about his time as a doctor in Georgia. He claims he was the night supervisor of a pediatric ward for an entire year. It's a hilarious, thrilling story in the movie, but the real files tell a different story. Frank did go to Georgia, but he wasn't a doctor. He was a guy who met a local girl, lied to her family about who he was, and then stole from them. The local police reports from that time don't mention a brilliant imposter working at a hospital. They mention a young man who was arrested for stealing a few checks and some camera equipment. There is no record at the hospital of him ever working there, not even as a volunteer. The same goes for his career as a lawyer. Frank says he passed the Louisiana bar exam and worked for the state attorney general's office. He even says he was the one who handled the legal work for the famous integration of the schools. It's an inspiring tale of a self-taught genius. But when you look at the payroll records for the state of Louisiana from that era, Frank's name is nowhere to be found. The Bar Association has no record of him. The truth is that he was a transient who was moving from town to town, cashing small-bore
checks at local grocery stores and gas stations. So why did Joe Shea go along with it? This is where the story gets really complicated. Joe Shea was instrumental in getting Frank released from prison early. He believed in rehabilitation, and he saw that Frank had a talent for talking. Shea helped Frank get a job as a security consultant, thinking that Frank's experience as a small-time forger could help banks spot fraud. It was a noble gesture, But once Frank got a taste of the spotlight, he realized that the truth didn't sell nearly as well as the lie. He began to exaggerate his past to increase his speaking fees, and as the stories got bigger, Joe Shea found himself in a difficult position. He liked Frank. He had spent hundreds of hours talking to him, but he also had a file cabinet full of evidence that Frank was making it all up. In his personal letters, Shea expressed a mix of frustration and amusement. He watched as his own life's work was transformed into a Hollywood fantasy where he was the bumbling foil to a brilliant criminal. The reality was that Shea didn't catch Frank because of a clever trick. He caught him because Frank was a sloppy criminal who kept going back to the same places. The famous arrest in France, depicted in the movie as a grand standoff with dozens of police cars, was actually much more mundane. Frank was recognized by a flight attendant he had dated, and he was picked up by the local authorities without any drama. There was no grand escape, no high-altitude jump from a plane. When Alan Logan confronted the FBI about these discrepancies, the response was telling. The agency essentially said that Frank was a private citizen, and what he said in his books was his own business. They didn't want to ruin the fairy tale, because by that point, the FBI was using Frank as a poster child for their own recruitment and public relations. They liked the idea that they were smart enough to hire a master criminal. It made the Bureau look sophisticated. But for the people who actually lived through Frank's real crimes, the legend is a slap in the face. Think about the families he actually stole from, the small business owners, the girlfriends, the neighbors. To them, he wasn't a hero. He was a guy who took their money and disappeared. The Catch Me If You Can narrative turns a series of petty betrayals into a victimless adventure. But the Joe Shea files show the victims. They show the letters from people wondering where their life savings went. They show the trail of broken trust that Frank left in his wake long before he ever stepped onto a stage to tell his tall tales. The most incredible part of this entire story is that Frank Abagnale Jr. actually did pull off one great con. He conned the world into believing he was a genius. He took a mediocre career as a small-time thief and rebranded it into a legendary saga of brilliance. He understood the psychology of the public. We want to believe that someone can beat the system. We want to believe in the underdog. And he gave us exactly what we wanted. Even today, Frank continues to give speeches and appear on news programs as a security expert. He has built a multi-million-dollar empire on a foundation of total fiction. And while he has admitted to some exaggerations over the years, the core of the lie remains. The Joe Shea files are the only thing that stands against the myth. They are a cold, hard reminder that the truth is often much less glamorous than the movies. Shea passed away a few years ago, but his records remain a testament to the reality of the situation. He was a man who tried to do the right thing, only to watch as the man he helped became a global icon for things he never actually did. It makes you wonder what else we've accepted as fact just because the story was told well. We live in an era of misinformation, but the story of Frank Abagnale shows us that this isn't a new phenomenon. We've always been suckers for a good story, especially one that makes us feel like anything is possible. But as we've seen today, sometimes the most impossible stories are exactly that, impossible. If you found this dive into the real FBI files of the world's most famous imposter fascinating, do us a favor and hit that like button. It helps us keep digging for the truth behind the legends. And if you want to see more content where we dismantle Hollywood myths and uncover the real stories behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed. There are plenty more files in the cabinet, and we're just getting started. What do you think? Does the fact that it was all a lie ruin the movie for you? Or do you think the lie itself is the ultimate masterpiece? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.